Shaq with Morrison Lee. Morrison Lee is a U.S. law firm. We deal primarily with content creators and emerging technologies, so VR, smart TVs, and the like. So we talked about sort of the high-level principles already in terms of disclosure, consent, data minimizations, and all those. And I think the important thing to take away from that, from the last two speakers, is that these general principles, whether in the US or in the EU, are the high level is pretty simple. Like, for example, they want you to disclose what data you have, where it's going, how are you using it, that sort of thing. But then when you get down to implementation, it gets really confusing and boring for your company. So it usually ends up with checklists or questionnaires that get passed around your organization. And on one level, it's going to be tedious for your organization to fill those out. And you're going to come back with a lot of questions, because there's a lot of things, whenever you're dealing with regulations that are sort of ill-defined or new, a lot of these complex questions. So for example, we talked about the definition of personal information has nuances to it. It can be difficult to interpret what those terms mean without sort of a long history of case law interpreting it. So how do you deal with that? And I want to just basically give you a sort of shortcut to dealing with both of those problems to address how do you operationalize vague regulations. So my trick here is basically to make friends. So you want to be the monkey, make friends with other organizations, make friends with other companies in your vertical, and regulators. So I'm going to give you a very specific example. I was at the Network Advertising Initiative until pretty recently. It's a ad tech trade group in the US. They focus on self-regulating privacy and online advertising. So if you see banner ads with shoes after you looked at a shoe website and it follows you around the web, we dealt with sort of the privacy and back-end data collection that happened with that and made some rules in the US for it. So about 2 years ago, there's a lot of talk about specifically programmatic television and addressable television. So I started and led a working group at NAI about how to deal with that. And it started sort of with a working group, by the way, is you meet maybe once a month with a conference call, and you start with updates to the regulatory landscape. Have things changed? Have updates been given? But then we also talked about goals. So oftentimes you'll have a working group to put out maybe a guidance document or a best practices document. In the case of GDPR, you might be working towards maybe an industry code of conduct to get approved by regulators. So we started down this road, and immediately we found out we had huge hurdles on a fundamental level. So ad tech companies were working with, say, TV manufacturers for the first time, and they weren't even speaking the same language. So they had, for example, the terminology for sort of a commercial in the middle of a video would be an interstitial ad in the ad tech world, but then you talk to a TV manufacturer and they call them TV spots. So there was a lot of issues with that, sort of unifying the terminology. And if the companies, in trying to develop compliance policies where, for example, a TV manufacturer needs to get consent on behalf of the ad tech company, and they're not even speaking about the same thing, be very problematic. We also found that in one of the first meetings, we had to figure out how to even start organizing all these different categories for smart TVs. So we basically ended up finding out that, like for example, is it useful to split it on-demand TV aside from other types of TV for compliance reasons? And we ended up finding out that splitting it up into OTT, ACR, and programmatic TV was the best combination of three things to sort of get started with where to disclose things. And all of those, it was a very important starting point, because at the end of the day, you need to disclose these things to consumers. So if you're not speaking the same language within your industry, it's going to be really hard to do that with anybody else. So just to give you an idea of how bad the communication was, one of the TV manufacturers I talked to, they heard ad tech companies want to work with them, and this is what they thought would happen when you're watching Game of Thrones. They thought that meant you get banner ads while you're watching TV. And now the ad tech companies had terminology to say, no, we're doing ACR. We're going to use data-driven information from online, bring it into your TV to sort of inform what's going on. So very quickly, the regulatory landscape at the time, after coming up with these definitions, we're working on sort of interpreting the confusing landscape in the US, which we have 3 different laws. There's a lot of confusion a lot of battles between FTC and FCC on various technologies on who owns what in terms of jurisdiction. So first of all, we had to figure out which rules applied to which technology, and it's sort of unsettled. For example, with FCC, we know for a fact that it applies to MVPDs, but does addressable TV fall under definition? There's not really any clear answers to that. And on the FTC side, it's unclear whether, for example, automatic content recognition falls under FTC or FCC. So there's a lot of just jurisdictional issues figuring out which laws apply to which technologies, which is part of what the working group was talking about and discussing. But once you do, within those rules, again, you had, if you do find out you're under the FTC regulations, they didn't have many cases about smart TVs at the time, so even then, you're working in sort of a very vague, nebulous area. And then you also had the Video Privacy Protection Act. We talked about class actions. There's a lot of class actions going on right now with that, so I won't go into more details. But this was about a year and a half ago, and now we have more complexity. So now we have Trump changing up administrative priorities within the FTC and FCC. So we have to sort of pay attention to that, and that's constantly changing just because of the chaos in that administration. And then in the US, US companies have to worry about GDPR as well. So you have to basically come up with, in the compliance world, a solution, say, for disclosures that works with all of these at the same time. So if you want to disclose things, you have to make sure you're hitting each one of these laws which do apply to you. So the working group was talking about sort of best practices and how to deal with that. And around summer of last year, while we're working on this, the FTC announced they're going to do a smart TV workshop, which generally means that they are going to put out a regulatory guidance, or they're going to go after a smart TV company, and they kind of want industry input on that before they do that. So having a working group in place, we're able to reach out to them and basically sit down, do a roundtable, and inform them, this is what the technologies are, these are terms that we use. I know you're scared of, say, the Viagra ad appearing while you're watching Game of Thrones, but that's not what actually is happening. And we sort of clarify what is possible, what's not, what is the state of the industry at any given time. So they found that very helpful. They liked it. They asked me to come speak on that panel. They brought in a few other industry people to be on there as well, and basically to help give voice to the industry as the FTC is sort of developing a policy. So having a working group is, again, has another benefit of sort of informing regulators. So as a quick mid-discussion recap, I discussed through a working group, you're working within your own industry to sort of unify terminology and best practices. You're working across different verticals, and especially connected TVs, because you have a lot of different players. And you want to talk to regulators. And there's a ton of benefits from this. As I mentioned, you can strategize on how to deal with maybe incomplete, or maybe in the US's case, inconsistent laws sometimes. And they're constantly changing all the time. So just having a group to sort of bounce those things off is really helpful. And then the regulators tend to like having an industry best practice. They tend to look at that. And having these discussions within groups tends to be way more fun than just sitting in a room and checking off checklists and doing questionnaires all by yourself. So if you, for example, want to tell, say you want to have a disclosure pop up when you start your TV or something, and your company pushes back, maybe the marketing department says that's a terrible UI, we can't sell that, then you might be able to come back and say, in this case, we have a working group, this is what the rest of the industry is doing. It's not just me interpreting vague law in some way. So, and there's cases when if you act alone without a working group, you tend to get in more attention and more trouble. So this is a big case in the US. Vizio got fined actually more than 2.2 million. That was to New Jersey. They paid another 1.5 million to the FTC. And this was basically, when the FTC gave their decision here, they did mention that their disclosures were inadequate and it didn't fit in with what the rest of the industry was doing. So they looked at, again, best practices. So had maybe Vizio been part of a working group where they kind of unified their strategy with other players in the industry, this might not have happened. Silverpush is another interesting case along the same lines where they were using an audio beacon technology. So basically what they wanted to do was play a small sound from your TV and find out what phones are linked or phones are nearby to sort of link browser histories with your TV. So the FTC was super creeped out by that, and they sent them a letter and said, you shouldn't do it. The interesting thing about Silverpush is, I was at NAI, I work with ad tech companies for years, and I've never heard of this company, and I've talked to other companies if they have, and pretty much they weren't working with anybody else that I knew of in the industry. So they were kind of acting in isolation, and I think that sort of led to a practice which didn't really fit into what industry norms were and drew attention to them. So again, acting alone can pose some legal risk. So one last friendship or relationship to build is the lawyers. Privacy lawyers tend to talk to technologists. It's sort of necessary as part of the job. I also recommend talking to marketing people. So one of the key things lawyers need to do is disclose what's actually happening. And lawyers tend to be notoriously bad at describing things, and marketing people tend to be good, but with the caveat that they tend to exaggerate things. So the combination of the lawyer and the marketing team can actually be really helpful in drafting disclosures which actually explain what's happening without running into legal problems. So I was going to go through specific disclosures, but I'm going to skip that so we have time for questions. And I want to just go over a couple points before I do that. Number one is if you are going to do a working group, you have to sort of pay attention to antitrust. You can't just go talking to other companies about anything. If you talk about anything relating to price fixing, anything about banning other players from the industry, that sort of thing, you can run into huge legal troubles. So I recommend working with a trade group, or if you're already part of a trade group that doesn't have a privacy working group yet, you might be willing to talk to them and say, hey, can you do this on our behalf? I'm not that familiar with EU trade groups, so I can maybe direct you to people in the US, but again, it's worth talking to any industry trade group in smart TV space about this. You also want a good moderator in your working group, so someone who can make sure the conversation doesn't get off the rails. It happens a lot. You also have, you tend to have some loud voices in a group that tend to dominate conversations. You don't want that either. And basically my takeaway from this is work with other people in the industry, work within your company. Don't do compliance on your own, especially when laws are new and vague. You want to establish best practices, and you want to basically have a say in what those best practices are. Okay.
Thank you, Shaq. Any questions for Shaq? So you talked about mainly the US regulatory environment, and then you mentioned GDPR at various times.
Yeah.
I'm interested also to know, with respect to the rest of the world, outside of the US and Europe, how compatible are all the regulatory regimes? Can you have a one-size-fits-all approach here? Because let's face it, the companies in this space, you know, they have ambitions to be global platforms, global players. They need something that works everywhere.
So South America doesn't enforce very much, so you take some legal risks there. And Australia is pretty similar to EU. And
Asia?
Asia is kind of a mess. So that's an area you need to sort of deal with on an individual basis. And Africa is kind of a Wild West as in itself. So basically, if you're in Europe and Australia and North America, you can maybe develop a system that works for all three. And beyond that, you need to sort of focus in on other areas.
Okay, good. Thank you very much.
Thank you.